and gentlemen, welcome to the LSE for this online event on political economies of energy transition. This event is co-hosted by the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and the Department for International Development here at the LSE. My name is Robert Faulkner. I'm the Research Director of the Grantham Research Institute, and I'll be chairing this panel discussion. We've convened a fantastic panel to launch a new book by Professor Cathy Hochstetler on the very title of Political Economies of Energy Transition, Wind and Solar Power in Brazil and South Africa. This book is the culmination of many years of deep research that Cathy has conducted in these two countries, but also beyond this. And in it she examines how both South Africa and Brazil, two middle-income countries, have gone about the transition away from fossil fuel energy and towards greener, renewable energy sources. The book highlights that the global energy transition that we obviously need to complete if we want to keep to under 2 degrees of global warming is not a straightforward process of just switching from one energy system to another. It's not just a question of moving to a new technological system. It involves complex and often difficult struggles between entrenched political economic interests. It requires active state intervention, but often depends on the presence of a capable state bureaucracy. And it engages not just climate policy concerns, but also questions of industrial policy and social justice. So I think it's safe to predict that this book will become the go-to text for anyone who wants to understand the political economy of energy transitions, and especially so in the global south, which is often less well researched in this literature. I'm sure the book will also stimulate many debates in the disciplines that Cathy and the book are located in: development studies, environmental politics, and climate policy. Now, to introduce the book and to discuss its implications, I'm pleased to be able to welcome to this panel discussion, first of all, the author of the book, Cathy Hochstetler, and also two discussants with deep knowledge in the area, Ken Shadlin from the LSE and Jonas Meckling from the University of California in Berkeley. I'm going to introduce each before their opening statements, and let me just briefly explain how the format for this event will work. Cathy will kick off with an overview of the book's main arguments and findings, and after that, I will invite our discussants to briefly respond to the presentation and the book that they have already read. And this will then be followed up by a Q&A session where I'll engage the audience. So if anyone in the audience would like to put a question to the panel, you can start doing so by going onto the Q&A button at the bottom. For those Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Energy Transition. I should also mention that we are recording the event in the hope that we will be able to make it available as a podcast afterwards, should there be no technical difficulties with the recording. So as usual, as I mentioned before, we want this to be an interactive event. We want to hear from you in the audience. So put your questions to the panel. You can submit your questions by using the Q&A feature at the bottom. Questions will be submitted to myself, so I will try and pose as many questions to the speakers as I can. It would be nice if you could let us know your name and your affiliation. And of course, we're particularly keen to hear from our students, alumni, and also any prospective students that are coming to the LSE. All right, so without much further ado, let me now introduce our main speaker of the event, the author of the book that we are launching, Cathy Hochstetler. Cathy is a professor of international development at the LSE, where she currently also serves as the head of the department. Her research interest is broadly in the field of environment and development. She has published widely on environmental and climate politics in the global south, and she has a long-standing interest in Brazil and other emerging powers. She's the author, together with Margaret Keck, of the prize-winning book, Greening Brazil, Environmental Activism in State and Society. Cathy, you have many accomplishments already behind you, but this new book is fascinating, and we're looking forward to hearing from you about what you've produced in this book. It's just come out with Cambridge University Press, and there's a discount available for those of you who would like to purchase it, and you should look out for further messages that are in the Zoom about this. Cathy, please take the floor. You will introduce the book's main argument. We look forward to this. Thank you for being with us here. The floor is yours, Cathy.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Robert, and for organizing this. When Robert suggested that we do a joint book launch between the Grantham Research Institute and the Department of International Development, I was really pleased because not only are these my two homes at the LSE, but they also are exactly the two communities that I'm trying to connect with this book. I think that scholars of development have a lot to learn about climate, and scholars of climate have a lot to learn about development. And my book really aims to connect those two worlds and to bring them into dialogue with each other. Traditionally, one begins a book launch with the origins of the project. And so maybe somebody out there needs to hear that the origins of this project were actually in failure. That way back in 2009, I was very interested in some new developmentalism in Brazil and South Africa, new state initiatives to build infrastructure, especially in the energy sector. And I wrote a grant proposal that was not funded. Later that year, I happened to go, well, I was in Europe for other reasons, and I went to the Copenhagen negotiation on climate change. And there I saw Brazil and South Africa, with India and China playing a really major role in that negotiation in Copenhagen in 2009. And so the next year, I wrote a new grant proposal. And the new grant proposal said, I want to understand the role of emerging powers in climate change and climate negotiations. And then I want to study how they implement their international commitments at home in state-driven energy infrastructure projects. So I snuck my first project into the second project, now framing it in the larger issues of climate change, and this one was funded. And so the new project then involved extensive field work. And as I got deeper into the research in Brazil and South Africa, I saw that there was a particularly interesting set of questions and a particularly interesting story to tell about wind and solar power in particular. And Robert's already told you how climate scholars and activists often talk about renewable energy, that in many ways, the easiest and increasingly the cheapest way to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is to electrify everything and decarbonize the electricity sector by building a lot of wind and solar power. So it's really an orientation that tells us that to address climate change, we need to have a lot of these new kinds of electricity. But if you go to look at the history of electricity production in Brazil and South Africa, you find a rather different story. You find really large amounts of wind power produced in Brazil, 10% of the built capacity. And you can see that's that top line that grows up strongly. But the slowest kind of electricity to develop in these two countries is actually Brazilian solar power, which is that red line that you see comes along much later after wind power and continues to be much lower. South Africa starts with a lot of initiative in wind and solar power, but then you see the line flattening out and going down. And when you look at these kinds of these cumulative electricity projects, you have to say they're clearly not in any simple way following the climate directive to build a lot of wind and solar power. And so the question then is, well, what does account for these differential outcomes in the two countries and for renewable energy there? And in particular, it leads to the intuition that then really shapes the book, that whatever the impact of climate considerations, that Brazil and South Africa are making decisions about wind and solar power that also must reflect other issues. And that's really the heart of the book, that idea. So the basic logic of the book is to examine the drivers of electricity choices in middle income and developing countries, in Brazil and South Africa in particular. And the idea is that Brazil and South Africa and other countries, not just them, other developing countries, but other countries even beyond the middle income and developing countries, really have a lot of different possible drivers of electricity outcomes. And I end up writing in the book a chapter on each of these different policy arenas that shape possibly renewable energy outcomes. Each of these are what I call a political economy. There's a structure of interest, there's a set of institutions, there's a set of power relations that interrelate on each of these topics. And it's quite notable. Each of these have something to say about whether or not wind and solar power will be produced. But as you look at them, they engage really different sets of actors who have really different kinds of interests. So that, for example, in climate change, you find environmental ministries, and environmental ministries are also very engaged in the fourth political economy, where we're looking at environmental impact assessment of putting particular projects in particular places. But environmental ministries don't get engaged in industrial policy. They don't have much to do with distribution and consumption of electricity. Instead, you have ministries of the economy, ministries of industry, you have public utilities. So you have a really different set of state actors in these different political economies. And you find ordinary citizens, non-state actors, appearing sometimes as climate activists, sometimes as renewable energy firms, sometimes as consumers of electricity, sometimes in the communities that host these projects. And this really requires thinking of a complex set of political economy processes that might be going on. And the basic methodology of the book is it has a chapter on each of these, and in each of the chapters it says, well, when we think about the interest structure associated with climate change, and we think about the institutions that are addressing climate change issues in these countries, what is the dynamic there? What kinds of processes are underway? And do those processes in some way account for those different outcomes for wind and solar power in the two countries? In other words, are all of these important? Are they important in the same way? And there's a kind of final question of the book about how these four political economies that are being built simultaneously and potentially separately, how they interlock. Do they together reinforce each other to tell some particular story about wind and solar power? Might they contradict each other? Might they be a lot of policies in favor of climate action that are undermined by industrial policies that promote fossil fuels, for example? So what's the relationship between these, and what does the final national political economy of energy transition look like? And there are really three big takeaways of the book that I want to just highlight. It's so wonderful to be able to talk about my book to a big audience, and so frustrating to be given 20 minutes to do it. So I really only have, I'm just going to draw out three big arguments, and then hopefully your questions and the discussants will draw out a few more of the details of this, because there's, believe me, lots of details in the book. But I have, like I say, three big arguments that I think are takeaways. One of them is that climate does matter. And in fact, the contrast between the two countries, I argue, has a great deal to do with their initial greenhouse gas emission structures, that those really set the comparison between the two countries and set the tone for the other political economies. If you look at South Africa, for example, that top line there on the left is South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector. And half of that is the electricity sector. And what that tells you is that if South Africa is going to address climate change, it has to start building non-fossil fuel sources of electricity. It has to shut down its coal-based electricity system. And so there's a real, there's clearly a very powerful industry and set of actors in South Africa that are based on coal-based electricity. And any kind of climate agenda is really an existential threat to them. So there's already a kind of high level of inevitable contestation around renewable energy, because it must, in the South African context, take on a really strong existing fossil fuel system. And that creates a major coalition that talks about climate change, doesn't directly challenge climate action, but then begins to challenge particular choices like building wind and solar power in not just in the climate political economy, but that same coalition shows up again to debate whether or not there should be industrial policy supporting renewable energy, and debating what the different costs and consumer benefits of different kinds of electricity are. So there's a real strong polarization that happens in South Africa that really derives from this fact that if you're going to be addressing climate change in South Africa, you must be really directly taking on this fossil fuel sector. And it gets complicated by the fact that the Zuma government, which is in power for much of this time period from 2009 until 2018, also has a state capture project where it hopes to use big nuclear and coal projects for patronage and for personal gain. So that's a kind of non-systematic factor that, that plays into this as well. So that really starts a highly politicized, highly contentious engagement with wind and solar power in South Africa. In Brazil, in contrast, when you go to look at Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions, its top line there, its big sector is deforestation and land use change. And if you follow Brazilian environmental politics at all, you know that climate politics is hugely contentious in Brazil, especially now under the Bolsonaro government. But what you may not know is that that's not really a debate that talks about wind and solar power. And in fact, it's rather remarkable how little of the discussion of wind and solar power in Brazil really references climate change, besides just acknowledging that these are generally low carbon sources of electricity. So all of the fight and the politicization of climate change in Brazil is about deforestation. And this then sets a kind of starting point for Brazilian ways of addressing wind and solar power, which is that it's not contentious, but that decisions about wind and solar power are usually taken in national bureaucracies following standard operating procedures. They do normal things, normal planning, normal decisions about industrial policy, and it never develops that kind of contentious aspect that wind and solar power have in South Africa. And a lot of that is because climate change really is not about renewable energy for these for that country. So I'm going to stop to share just because my second 2 points have less in the way of graphics, and you can look at me and see my nice plant in the background with its little orange and enjoy that. So that's the first point, that climate really does matter for setting the basic tone of renewable energy policy in the two countries, and because it's an important differentiator between the experiences of Brazil with those of South Africa, with Brazil being a much less contentious version, possibly achievable when there's not a major fossil fuel sector in electricity, with South Africa representing what happens when there is. But the second takeaway is in some ways the opposite of that, that in both of these countries, much of the debate about wind and solar power is actually about the economics of wind and solar power. So the chapters that end up being very influential for both countries are the chapters that talk about the costs of renewable energy versus other kinds of electricity. And then both countries also have a real preoccupation with industrial policy and with questions like, can we build an industry on the basis of wind and solar power? What kinds of jobs are going to be available? And those are the issues that are hugely influential in the Brazilian context. And in fact, if you want to understand why solar power is so slow to come about, whereas wind power starts earlier and is so much more successful, you really have to look at these kinds of economic kinds of considerations, so that Brazil is able to build an industry in wind power of domestic production, manufacturing capacity much more easily than it can do that in solar power. And that solar power is quite a bit more expensive than wind power. And that's also a really big part of the Brazilian calculations about which of those it does first and to what extent. Interestingly, the big question in South Africa is actually an earlier question, or one of the big questions in South Africa is actually an earlier question about economics, which is the big question of, should electricity be produced by the public sector or by private firms? And this becomes a very large debate in South Africa. And it's complicated by the fact that all of the coal, or most of the coal and the nuclear, are built and operated in South Africa by the state-run public utility, whereas the wind and solar power is almost entirely built and operated by private firms. And so questions about the state control of the economy versus private profits and private actors become very enmeshed with the question in South Africa of whether or not there should be wind and solar power built. And in fact, it's one of the big issues that moves the labor movement from a coalition in favor of wind and solar power to being one of the actors that is the most hesitant. And they are then also disappointed by the jobs that appear from renewable energy. And so that is, again, an element that creates a lot of questions. And if you want to just step away from these countries, and I am almost finishing here, Robert, I know you're probably watching the time, but if you want to step away from these countries, I think there's an even bigger and more interesting question here, because one of the concepts that we've talked about a lot in talking about climate transitions is about ideas like a Green New Deal. And the big argument of the Green New Deal is that you can build coalitions in favor of climate action by showing the way that that also solves problems of housing, of jobs, of industrial development. And so it's a claim, it's a promise that you can build a bigger coalition to work on climate by attaching climate to these other sectors. But I think especially the South African case makes us need to think about the fact that there may be some hazards of that, because what if the jobs don't appear? What if the promised benefits are not as present as they are in the promises? One of the things that can come out of this kind of strategy is that you can also build a wider opposition of actors that are disappointed in the promises of renewable energy and an energy transition if those benefits don't appear. And then the final point that I would say, there's a lot of discussion about the fact that renewable energy is a new industry, and compared to other parts of the economy, it really offers these new possibilities and new ways of doing things. It's very disruptive. All of this kind of language is part of what makes people excited about wind and solar power. It looks like it has a lot of opportunities for innovation. But I think that one of the things that my book shows as a whole is that countries do this new industry with their old political economy, that existing institutions, existing ways of doing things, existing power relations really shape how Brazil and South Africa and countries in general do this new industry. One of the places where this is particularly stark in these two cases is in South Africa. The legacy of apartheid just runs through the electricity sector in ways that show that you can't just construct new industries on old existing power relationships without thinking about the implications that they have. So in the apartheid period and later, much of the labor force in coal is a Black African labor force, which doesn't have a lot of economic alternatives. And that becomes part of the debate because they're a major part of the political legitimization of the African National Congress Party. And so some of what the party does in these decisions really reflects that long-standing labor history. Or the fact that the apartheid government didn't bring electricity services to Black communities in South Africa meant a particularly big deficit for post-apartheid governments to take up in electricity. And then more prosaically, you find some examples in Brazil. Brazil has auctions where companies bid to build electricity. And it turns out that you can win those bids more easily if you have money from the Brazilian National Development Bank, the BNDES. But the Brazilian National Development Bank has 50 years of a particular way of dealing with questions like local content policy and what kinds of projects it does and doesn't finance. And those rules end up favoring wind power in ways that they don't favor solar power. So the Brazilian National Development Bank handles finance for these projects in much the same way as it handles for other projects. And that creates, again, this differential outcome between wind and solar power. So I'm just skimming the surface here, and I promise you there's a lot more there to dig into should you buy the book and read it. And I look forward to hearing the comments from Jonas and from Ken and to hearing your questions and comments, and just want to close by thanking Robert again for organizing this, for Jonas and Ken for being willing to make their comments, and to all of you for being part of the audience for this. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Kathy. That was a splendid summary. Actually, having read the book, I was going to look very carefully at how you would manage to capture the richness of the analysis. You have clearly spent many, many years in the two cases, in the two countries, and the narratives you develop, the analysis you lay on is very rich and deep. So that was a splendid summary, and I'm sure it'll provoke a lot of discussion. Without much further ado, let me introduce our first discussant, Ken Shadlin, who is a colleague of Kathy's, a professor of development studies here at the LSE in the Department of International Development. Ken's research focuses on the comparative and international political economy of development. He's particularly interested in the drivers of diverse national responses to changing external conditions and global rules. And his particular empirical field, he's a specialist in Latin American political economy. He's focused on intellectual property rights, the pharmaceutical sector. And in 2017, he published a fantastic book on coalitions and compliance, the political economy of pharmaceutical patents in Latin America, where he analyzes how countries introduced pharmaceutical patents in the 90s and then subsequently revised their patent systems in the 2000s. Ken is going to respond to Kathy's presentation and the book, which he has received in advance, focusing particularly on the development dimensions of the argument that Kathy makes. Ken, welcome to this panel discussion. The floor is yours.
Super. Thank you very much, Robert. Thanks for inviting me to participate. And as you might have noticed in my, as Robert was introducing me and talking about my areas of expertise and work, he didn't mention the environment, because I'm not actually an environment specialist, and that's why I'm here. Because I've been asked to talk about sort of what are some of the broader lessons from this book for development studies more generally. And I'll start off by saying there are many, and it's a book that's well worth reading, even if you're not an environment and development person like I am. So I'm going to begin, and I'm going to point to four. But before I point to those four, I just want to quickly just say congratulations to Kathy. I'd seen small parts of this book over the years. We talked about it, seen parts of it presented at conferences, and it really is a pleasure to see it all in one place. And having the opportunity to sit down and read it was a pleasure. So let me talk about four things about that I think are really important in Kathy's book for thinking about broader issues in the political economy of development. The one, which is the most obvious and jumps off the screen, but is Kathy's analysis of industrial policy. So clearly, you know, there's a challenge that we have, or the world has, between linking environmental protection, particularly sort of climate change mitigation, and economic development. And there's obviously a huge literature on this, which I suppose people refer to as green growth, about how to resolve these tensions, how to convert conflicts into complementarities and find synergies. And this relates to parallel debates, between links between economic development and other areas, say health policy or something. So the book has a wonderful chapter on green industrial policy. The great thing about green industrial policy, the way it's discussed in this chapter, sometimes more explicitly than others, is that the performance requirements that you need to have a successful industrial policy are built in. So one of the challenges of industrial policy that we know from people like Alice Amsden, Donnie Roderick, is imposing performance requirements and removing the supports from recipients after they've been presented. So Amsden calls that reciprocal control mechanisms. Roderick talks about how the problem is not picking the winners, the problem with industrial policy is punishing the losers. The thing with it, when industrial policy is linked to other areas, for example, non-carbon power production, the performance requirements are built in because the government can have an explicit target in that other area. It's basically saying to the beneficiaries or the recipients of its largesse, meet a certain level of power production or else. In some conversations, Kathy's referred to that as sort of demand side industrial policy. And the point is, I think it's at a point that goes beyond the book, and this is more broadly, is that when the industrial policy is there to meet like a linked demand, in this case, reducing carbon emissions, it can make them easier, it can make the instrument easier to retire, because the government is saying, we're going to dish out the goodies to obtain this objective, and if you don't meet the objectives, withdrawing it should be easier. So I think there's a broader lesson there. Second thing that I want to point to is there's a big issue about sort of how changes in the global economy affect domestic political economic processes. And in some ways, that is like what the international political economy of development is all about. And the way this happens is that what happens out there can reshape political coalitions in here that are in favor or against different responses. And it can do this by mobilizing different sets of actors. It can differentially, it can do this by providing different actors with different resources, whether they are material resources or ideational resources. So it's not that what happens within the countries is driven necessarily by some sort of external change, but what happens in the external environment sort of can reconfigure domestic politics. Now, in the areas where I've worked on that, in trade and intellectual property, what's going on, what I'm calling out there, are very strong rules. So you could sort of, it's easy to directly show how these external changes sort of mobilize some sets of actors and demobilize other sets of actors. What's interesting here is that this is all taking place in the context of, if I can say, pretty weak international climate regime that sort of, and I'm just wondering, so one of the questions I'm wondering is how a stronger international climate regime might have altered the balance of power between these two rival coalitions that feature throughout the book. So that's a comment about an area that I think is quite important, but there's also a question in there. My next area is also ends with a question, which is the book is about state agency. And so like one reading of the book, and this is a book about state agency, or more specifically, the conditions under which states have agency to act. So in Brazil, the status quo coalition was quite weak. And this gave more opportunities for bureaucratic state-led changes, as Kathy just said towards the end of her remarks. In South Africa, the status quo coalition around carbon was exceptionally strong. And so the state agency was much more constrained, it was more hampered. This suggests, these are my words, not Kathy's words, this suggests that the conditions for state agency in this area are set by sort of national legacies of power generation. And so the question that leads me to is, knowing nothing about these issues in any countries of the world other than Brazil and South Africa, which I now know something about, is are more countries like Brazil or are more countries like South Africa? In general, would we expect more countries to have Brazilian-like state agency, or would we expect more countries to be sort of constrained greatly in what they do, like they were in the South Africa case? Finally, or almost finally, I'm really interested in aspects of timing. And I think there's an important, subtle, and sort of perhaps underdeveloped, but certainly unexplicit message in this book about timing. So one of the things that I was interested in reading this was how long it takes from when policy decisions are made and put into place until when we see the effects. So for example, that figure that Kathy pointed to, put up at the beginning of the presentation, and it's figure 1.1 in the first chapter, are the outputs that we're observing in, say, 2018, are they a function of policy choices in 2017, 2015, 2012, 2000? When do the policies have to be put in place to see the effects? And obviously, at any point, they can be derailed. You can do something for 10 years and then you change it, and then all that previous work probably gets thrown down the drain. And so the answer is probably all of the above. It takes continuity. And I think that's really important because it leads to 2 points. One is specific to energy, which is the amount of time that we need for this sort of alternative energy production different than the amount of time you need by the time you change your regulatory policy in some other area to when you see the outcomes? Is energy different because it requires longer time periods? But the other point I want to make is more general about temporality. There's a huge asymmetry that we need to do things continuously. You have to keep on plowing away at it. And if you stop doing it, then everything gets thrown off course. All the previous efforts get wiped out. And I think that's not just a story of I'm sort of retelling the South Africa version of what happens after, say, 2014 in South Africa and there in my own language. But I think that's a more broadly reflective of development processes that are cumulative, and they require accumulation in terms of the policy outputs, and they can be easily derailed. And there's a huge asymmetry because you could sort of be doing I don't like saying the right things, it's a loaded terminology, but you can be doing things a certain way for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and all it takes is not doing it that way for 1 year, and suddenly everything gets thrown off course. Zigzags are seriously problematic. Interruptions have long and damaging legacies. And I think that's like a lesson that I took out of this book, which I think speaks to broader, important points in the political economy of development. So again, I'm not an expert on this topic, but I really enjoyed reading it. And I think there's a lot there for anybody who's not an expert or who's not an environmental specialist, who just is interested in the political economy of development to read and think about and learn. I do have, if I could just say, Kathy, I have one tiny criticism about your book, which is I don't like the cover. Because as I look at the orange cover, I'm not sure if that's supposed to be referring to the sunset, which sort of suggests that it's all over, it's too late, or whether it's suggesting that there's a raging fire in the background. So if I have one suggestion for the book, is that when the second edition comes out, or when the paperback maybe comes out, you could revise the cover. But really, I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm honored to have a chance to talk about it at this crowd tonight. And now I look forward to hearing Jonas's comments. Thanks.
Wonderful, Ken. Thank you for that very rich set of comments. There's a lot for Kathy to respond to, but I'll give you a chance to come back to this in just a moment. And as Ken just demonstrated, the only thing that academics spend more time on than researching their publications and books is obviously choosing the book cover. So we'll have to hear from Kathy what she thought about the tone there. I'm always pleased to say, I have to say, when books on environmental topics don't come in deep shades of green, because that always makes for a nice break to the usual publisher choice. Anyway, without much further ado, I'm now delighted to hand over to our second discussant, Jonas Meckling. Jonas is an associate professor at the University of California at Berkeley, where he leads the Energy and Environmental Policy Lab. His focus is on the comparative and international politics of climate and clean energy policy. It will be widely known among those of you who work in that field that Jonas has published widely in this area. He's the author of 2 books, the fantastic book Carbon Coalitions, Business Climate Politics and the Rise of Emissions Trading came out with MIT Press. Before moving to the US, Jonas served in various functions in politics too. He was a senior advisor to the German Minister for the Environment. And after his time as a PhD student, he moved to Harvard University, where he worked as a research fellow. It is great to welcome Jonas back to the LSE, although it is only in a virtual format, because I'd like to mention and remind everyone that, of course, Jonas did his PhD at the LSE in the International Relations Department. So it's a real pleasure, Jonas, that you could join us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Robert. You dropped the little fact that you were my doctoral advisor. Okay, so thanks so much for inviting me. It's been a total joy to delve into this book, and many congratulations to Kathy to write a book that's so generative for two major fields. To me, this is the most immersive exploration of clean energy traditions out there. The four political economies offer different avenues, different angles to the very same outcome question of renewable energy deployment. And by immersing itself in the complexity of clean energy transition through these four political economies, the book is inductive work at its best, generating lots of insight and hypotheses. And as such, I see it very much an agenda-setting study for energy transitions research broadly. In my comments, I focus on the empirical focus on emerging economies first, then on the specific analytical approach the book takes, and then the question of variation of energy transitions. And for each of these topics, I'll highlight some of the key contributions I see in there for the broader field of climate, environmental, energy politics, and the kinds of questions that arose for me out of the book. So first of all, the context of emerging economies. In that empirical shift, it represents a major advance in the comparative study of climate and energy politics. So climate politics has taken a comparative turn. It emerged in international relations, and now a greater focus is on the domestic drivers of climate policy action. And most of the books out there are focused on industrialized countries and on China. And Kathy takes it to emerging economies, and that is of great empirical relevance, not just because most of economic growth will be there, most of greenhouse gas emission growth will likely be there, and we need to understand the domestic economy to identify possible policymaker interventions. And this shift brings a different focus on key politically salient topics with it, especially the salience of energy access in the context of developing and emerging countries, and the specific salience of economic growth. And as Kathy alluded earlier, the discussion of economic growth might look quite different in a place like South Africa, like Brazil, compared to Western economies, especially the idea of export-driven industrial policy may have challenges. Maybe there is more of a question of reducing the cost of electricity input, and that is more the industrial motive. There is a lot of variation even within this theme of economic growth as a key driver. The empirical shift that Kathy takes has some theoretical dividends that go far beyond the focus on emerging economies and transitions. The book frames it in the terms of political economy transitions, the politics of economic transformation, bringing in the development literature, which I find extremely useful for the climate policy debate, because we are no longer looking at single policy issues. These cut across policy issues, across sectors, and are major transformations of economies, structural economic change. And by reframing it in those terms, it creates a bigger theoretical purview and puts it into the broader context of comparative political economy and market reforms, into the context of late industrialization of East Asian economies, into the context of liberalization, privatization, these big market transformations. And I think that's an important theoretical reframing of climate policy and energy transitions. So a question that arises for me, particularly from the focus on emerging economies, is the role of state-owned enterprises. It's an empirical theme in the book, not necessarily a big conceptual theoretical theme, but a lot of the energy-related industries in emerging economies have state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises hold the greatest reserves of oil, and they play key roles in the electricity sector and transport-related sectors. So they have to do with stranded assets, but they also play a major role in producing the environmental goods and deploying clean energy technologies. And we know from earlier studies that the governance of state-owned enterprises shape their strategy and performance. For instance, 10 years ago, David Victor published a large study. And I think that question becomes really, really salient in the context of clean energy transitions. It's not necessarily clear what the relationship is. For example, Eskom, the state-owned electric utility in South Africa, seems to be using its monopoly power and its embeddedness in the state to block progress. But then we can contrast this with the new electric vehicle state-owned electric vehicle makers in China being an accelerator of Chinese goals to develop an electric vehicle industry, for instance. So I think there are lots of questions going forward. So let me move on to the analytical perspective, the interlocking of energy transitions, which I found highly instructive. It goes from this single issue lens on climate policy to all the key issues that play a role in this major transformation of the energy sector. And this requires enormous theoretical and empirical breadth. So only people like Kathy position between development and environmental studies and have the guts to look at infrastructure policy and industrial policy, energy access and environmental policy can bring this together. A couple of real benefits, analytical benefits arrive from this for me. It allows us to make sense of uneven progress across arenas of the energy transition. For instance, China had significant progress in developing industrial policy and manufacturing capacity, but no deployment. That came at a later stage. Or, for instance, Germany and California are taking very different approaches to the distribution question. More storage deployment in California, more grid integration in Germany. So the political economies differ there quite distinctly. It also broadens a particular analytical lens that has developed in energy transitions. A lot of work focuses on policy feedback, how initial policy steps develop political dynamics that feed back on the original policy. But the four interlocking logics suggest that we need to look at dynamics across these four political economies to ultimately understand the progress of the total energy transition. And I think that's a very important broadening of the analysis here. So what kind of questions come out of this? I think the idea for interlocking logics is universal. Their specific manifestation is more unique to countries. So energy access, emerging economies, developing countries. But then, for instance, industrialized countries may be more concerned with national security concerns, which was a whole political economy playing a role in the European transition and the US transition and China. So I think, how does this manifest across countries? But the lens itself works very well across countries. So then the book introduces the idea of hierarchies across these four political economies. And how does that affect reinforcing versus counteracting dynamics? I think is something to explore. And then I think we can also witness a merging of political economies. In the US context, for instance, the climate policy domain and the industrial policy domain are merging currently in the Biden agenda. That is an interesting phenomenon. So I think these four interlocking logics offer us a lens to study a number of highly relevant phenomena to the ultimate outcomes in energy transitions. So let me turn to my last point, varieties of energy transition, variation across countries. This is the big contrast that the book draws is the politicized versus the more technocratic, bureaucratic patterns of deployment. And one input to this is variation in interest configurations, but another input to that is institutions, and especially the idea of state capacity. And that way, the book brings in the state back in, very much in line with the title of a book written more than 30 years ago, but it's a very important step to be done for the study of energy transitions. And it does it in two analytically interesting ways. First, it's a very relational view of the state that looks at how does the state relate to producers and various interests in kind of insulating the state from opposition, mobilizing those that support the transition, and then the idea of the state as a heterogeneous actor, not just looking at the relationship with state and interest groups, but also at different agencies. In the ESCOM case, how is ESCOM stronger than the Department of the Environment in South Africa, and how does this conflict play out in the state? So I think those two are really important lenses going forward in studying state capacity in energy transitions. The big question for me here, which runs throughout the book, and I think the book remains inconclusive about it, but I think it raises very interesting aspects around this question, is do we see variation across countries or sectors? Are energy transitions, mostly the political economy, is really national logics or sector or logic, and how do these intersect? The evidence in the book suggests both is possible. But for instance, one of the reasons the South Africa case is so politicized is the existence of an incumbent invested in coal, ESCOM. Brazil doesn't have that incumbent, but Brazil has the incumbent in the oil sector and transport sector as Petrobras. So would we expect a transport transition in Brazil that's similarly politicized as South Africa? So electricity transition. So the question here is institutional patterns, do they play more of a role at sectoral versus national level? And then even a step further, how do these institutions interact with technological characteristics? Because we see even variation within one sector between wind and solar. Kathy earlier mentioned the financial lending policies in Brazil incentivizing wind. So taken together, this book takes the study of the comparative politics of clean energy transition to a highly relevant place, emerging economies, while generating analytical perspectives and questions that are really setting the agenda for the rest of us. And for that, thank you, Kathy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jonas. I think, Kathy, you've got a very rich set of comments here. I promised I would give you a chance to reply. You don't have to go through every point, of course, but this is your opportunity just to respond to a few questions, or indeed tell us about the choice of the book cover, which I love. Anyway, Kathy, you have a few minutes to respond, and then I'm going to open up for Q&A. We already have a lot of questions coming in. If anyone else in the audience would like to put a question to Kathy or the other discussants, then please write so in the Q&A function, and also tell us who you are if you have a connection to LSE or any other institution. Thank you. Kathy.
Well, thank you in particular to both Jonas and Ken for these really thought-provoking comments. I mean, it's always kind of interesting to me that one writes a book and one thinks that one has understood a topic, and then people read the book, and then I learn things from the people who read the book that apparently are in my book that I don't know that I put them there. But I love the way there's that kind of generative process that one begins to experience when the book is out in the world, and you start to hear the things that people say back and engage. And I thank you both for your careful reads and your generous comments. And of course, we have to take the most important question first, which is the question of the cover. And I just want to say, my first book was blue, my second book was yellow, my third one was green. And so, you know, orange was the color. But I actually chose this cover for a different reason, because I don't know if you can see, but this was one of the pictures of renewable energy that had people in it. And I picked this cover because I really wanted to make that point that renewable energy takes place in a world of human beings. And in fact, this is a picture from northeastern Brazil, where wind plants were located on beaches that people use. And this is actually part of the politics of wind power in Brazil, this placement of wind. So I'm sorry Ken doesn't like orange, but I think I'm going to stick with it. And I guess it means that my next book is going to have to be purple, because I don't know what other colors I haven't used so far. But thank you for raising that incredibly important issue. Just really a couple of things to say back. I thought your observations, Ken, about the international sector the very accurate observation that the international climate regime is quite a weak international setting, as opposed to some of the other kinds of international regimes that one might have. You know, the interesting thing is I originally thought that each of my chapters would have a substantial international component. And I was rather surprised that there wasn't more of an international dimension as people talked about how they thought about all kinds of issues. But I do think, just to answer your, or to respond to your particular comment, yes, if there were a stronger climate regime that really were able to require an energy transition and lower emissions, that would have quite an influence, especially on the South African case. And in many ways, though, even that very weak regime did provide many of the initial impulses that set what there is of a climate agenda in place as South Africans responded to the international agenda. So in fact, even a quite weak international regime had some effect, especially in South Africa, and a strong climate regime, I think you're right, would have quite a strong effect. Are more countries like Brazil or like South Africa? I think, well, first you should know that Brazil has an unusually low carbon electricity sector because it has so much hydropower, and that's not free of carbon emissions, but it's much lower. Most advanced industrial economies are more like South Africa in the sense that they have sort of large built infrastructures that have a lot of fossil fuels as their source of electricity. But I think the much of the developing world is actually more like the Brazilian case, just because much of the developing world has yet to really build out most of the electricity structure that it's going to be building in the next 30, 50 years. And so I think, in fact, many developing countries are going to effectively look like Brazil because there isn't yet a strong fossil fuel incumbent. In some ways, they benefit from the fact that they don't have that incumbent there. And so while I think much of the existing set of countries that have really thought about energy transition look more like South Africa, Brazil, I think, is something of a model for what we could expect from other places. And then just the question of timing, because I think it's important for understanding sort of the role that renewable energy plays in the whole system. It is much faster to build a wind power plant or put up solar cells than it is to build coal and nuclear facilities, which can take a decade or longer to build. And so in contrast, you can build wind and solar installations in weeks or in 18 months for wind power plants. So one of the attractivenesses of these kinds of electricity, and in fact, in both countries, it's an electricity supply crisis, and the fact that wind and solar power can be built quickly, that really starts the discussion about using wind and solar power. But that time issue is really quite important. You notice I kind of skipped over your industrial policy question because those are big points, and I really appreciate the comments there about green industrial policy and the ways in which having these multiple I hadn't really thought about that, these multiple demands coming from other industrial policy goals. That it's an important point about what that means in terms of the built-in rollbacks of these industrial projects that don't achieve those ends. So I think that's really quite an important piece. For Jonas, again, thank you very much. I thought your question about the role of state-owned enterprises is, it's a research topic that I can't answer, but it is absolutely sitting there as an agenda for people to look at. I did not expect the question of state-owned enterprises to be particularly important in this book when I first started it. But it became apparent quite quickly, especially in the questions of industrial policy, the fact that Brazil had already begun privatization of its electricity sector in the 1990s before it ever started to work on substantial amounts of wind and solar power, really took that issue off the board in important ways. whereas in South Africa, that just became central. And then Eskom, there have been a number of books written about Eskom itself, but such an interesting actor, not only in the things that it did, but also the things that political actors did with Eskom that were often not to the benefit of the institution. It would warrant a whole book in and of itself, multiple books probably, but I think that this is really an interesting agenda to look at the intersection between state-owned actors and the electricity and energy sectors. And then just skipping, because I know I'm taking too long, I think your final question about is the variation across countries or across sectors is something, you always hate it when somebody comments on your work publicly and they sort of put their finger on something that is a kind of profound ambiguity in your own argument. But, the fact that Brazil might not have a high carbon electricity sector, but has in many ways another state-owned actor or state-controlled actor, Petrobras, in the petroleum sector. If I were to write about energy politics more broadly in Brazil and not electricity in particular, I'm very careful to always make that circumscription. I think I would be looking at some dynamics in Brazil that would actually be, as you say, much more parallel to those of South Africa. So that's a real challenge and ambiguity. And one of the directions that I've thought of going from here is to return to that idea that I had way back in 2009 that didn't get funded, and try to look more broadly at not just the electricity sector and not just wind and solar power, but actually now that I understand those, to relocate them in the energy sectors writ large in those countries, because I think it would raise exactly these kinds of questions.
Good, wonderful. We have received quite a good number of questions from the audience, and I'd like to bring them in now. I'm going to try and bunch some of the questions together so that we can get in as many as possible. And all panelists should please feel free to answer the questions that they like to answer or not. I'm going to start with the two questions that focus on the labor market and jobs in the renewable and traditional energy sector. There's first of all a question from Niels Handler, who's an alum in development studies at the LSE, now at the Berlin School of Economics. And Niels has a question about whether and how the jobs created compare between fossil fuels and the renewable sector in those case studies. And he refers to Professor Edenhofer, one of the leading German climate economists, who predicts a coal renaissance due to the fiscal multipliers of power plants, and whether people on the panel agree with this. So how did the job creation work out between these two sectors as countries embarked on the transition? And there's another question from Laura Mann, who says, she starts off saying, "Great talk, Kathy." She wanted to ask if you can please speak about the variations in terms of the skill, intensity, and the bargaining power of green jobs versus traditional jobs, and how either political context or industrial context shape this variation. So two questions around the question of jobs, and of course that's an important dimension to any green transition, which is not just to reduce the amount of so-called dirty jobs, but to create new, cleaner ones. Kathy, do you want to start with that, and then anyone can add if they like?
Yeah, I'll start with that. And I know this is also a topic that Jonas has looked at, and I hope he'll come in too, because I'll answer parts of it, but this is quite a complex question. And maybe to sort of start with a framework. So with renewable energy, there's quite a few jobs in construction. There are some jobs in operations and maintenance. And if there is a manufacturing of components set up, there might also be jobs in manufacturing. But I think it's important to notice that renewable energy does not have a couple of the kinds of jobs that might be there in other kinds of electricity. So for example, the largest number of jobs in South Africa are actually coal miners. And because fossil fuel plants require a constant stream of fuels and a constant input of fuels, as opposed to simply having the wind blow, there are many more jobs associated with the fuel source part of the electricity project in fossil fuel plants than there are in wind and solar plants. So there's already a whole category of jobs that ends up not existing in renewable energy. I mean, that's of course one of their attractions. They don't require a constant input of fuels, either the fuels themselves and also the labor. It's one of the things that make them expensive to build, but then cheaper over the long term. But it does create a really different kind of job structure. The other thing, and I think this is some of the things that Laura might be asking about with skill intensity and bargaining power, there's generally speaking, the skill intensity of renewable energy is going to be higher than the skill intensity of fossil fuel jobs, especially in the coal sector. So that's the case. And it is far from clear, for example, that someone who has been working mining coal can readily move into renewable energy jobs. They're just a really different set of jobs. But the other thing to notice, and this is kind of more about the structure of the plants themselves, which is that ongoing jobs in renewable energy of sort of keeping wind and solar plants running are quite distributed versus the jobs that are there for keeping a coal power plant running, where you have a big facility where multiple people work in South Africa. The plants themselves are right next to the mines. And so there's a lot more scope for labor mobilization and labor organization in a traditional coal mine, especially the way that coal mine and coal plant, especially as they're set up in South Africa. And I think Jonas can also fill in more of this, and I'm skipping around a little bit here. But I think one of the things that it says is that the nature of the jobs that are provided by fossil fuel plants versus the nature of the jobs that are provided by renewable energy are extremely different. And there is not any kind of easy transition of actors from one to the other. And it's not something that we should probably expect. So one thing that I haven't even said these words yet tonight, but it's very much a theme in the book. This is one of the reasons why one of the big debates around energy transitions is about the idea of a just transition and about the fact that there will need to be some kind of ways of addressing the dislocations that come about for workers that have been working in fossil fuel sectors as they move into to non-fossil fuel sectors. And then I'm just going to say one more thing. The other thing is that many countries of the world have engaged with renewable energy in part because of a very specific subset of jobs that they are hoping to create in their economies, which are the manufacturing jobs. But the number of countries that want to have large numbers of manufacturing jobs in renewable energy components has always been much larger than would be really plausible, because there are large numbers of those jobs only where there's quite a bit of exporting, and the number of countries that can export wind and solar components was always going to be limited. And the fact that two of the most industrialized countries in their continents have such trouble setting up manufacturing sectors for wind and solar power suggests that the number of countries that are going to be able to really do this is much smaller than the promises.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Jonas, do you want to briefly respond to that on the basis of your own research?
Yeah, maybe two very brief comments. The job creation along the value chain, I think, is an important aspect. What level of integration, or what aspects of the value chain do you capture in any given national economy? And from the solar industry, for instance, a lot was solar policy was sold on the basis of manufacturing jobs, but manufacturing jobs are a small part compared to the job through deployment and installing jobs. So I think that's one aspect when thinking about jobs. The other one is not every job is politically equal as, say, another job. And especially manufacturing jobs have gotten a lot of salience. We see this in the politics of trade disputes around solar and wind. A lot of other jobs are being sacrificed to protect manufacturing shop. And that raises the interesting question of the organization of labor in energy transitions. And I think that's a really interesting field. What are the unionization levels across different types of energy technologies? How can these new jobs exert political power? I think those are important questions, and not just the number of jobs matters, but also how do they translate into political power?
Very good indeed. Let me get in some more questions. I'm going to bunch two questions together again. Let me start with Jared Finnegan, who got his PhD at the LSE very recently, who is now a postdoc at UC Berkeley as well, and is engaged with the LSE as a visiting fellow at the Grantham Institute. He has a particular question about the role that political parties play in these transitions. We've heard a lot about states and state bureaucracy, but to what extent are parties key actors? And he talks about how you, Kathy, how you mentioned the ANC and its link to the coal workers and unions. And this, he suggests, could have two readings. One is that therefore they're very exposed to this kind of pressure. On the other hand, since they've never lost an election since independence, since apartheid ended, does it also insulate them perhaps in the transition process? So that's the first question. And then there was a second question, which goes in a similar direction, by James Putzel, who says he's interested in the relative progress that these different countries have made towards wind and solar policy. And he wants to know about the political coalitions and what role they've played. And he wants to know whether one could see a major change under Bolsonaro in Brazil and Ramaphosa in South Africa, what it would take to bring about that change. And he would like you to just comment on the different prospects for this kind of shift in political coalitions.
Yeah, well, the two countries have really strikingly different party systems, and partly because of that, then the parties have really different relationships to the renewable energy question. And in some ways, they're kind of the most opposite in terms of party systems and in terms of democratic party systems of countries that I know well. So as Jared says, in the South African context, the ANC has won all national elections and most subnational elections since the transition from apartheid in 1994. So it really is a kind of classic dominant party. But what happens and this is really, what happens with dominant parties around the world is that all of the political conflict then, or much of the relevant policy conflict, moves inside the dominant party. And so what you have in South Africa then is you have factions inside the ANC, some of which are strongly tied to that coal-based labor. But you have other factions that might be related to new Black entrepreneurs. And you have other factions that the ANC is hugely divided on the question of public versus private provision of electricity. So one of the reasons that South Africa has this kind of stalemate is because the ANC has all of those conflicts inside of it. Should the ANC ever be able to take some kind of decisive position on privatization of Eskom, it'll happen. But the ANC has been arguing inside itself about whether or not Eskom should be privatized at least since 1997. So, and that debate hasn't been set. So in some ways, what happens then is you have a party that as you say, is very exposed to its labor parties, but it's also in some ways insulated from them. But it is so profoundly factionalized that it can't move in many cases. And that's a real significant part of the story. And that doesn't change as the system changes from Zuma to Ramaphosa. They both are in that same highly factionalized party, now with one faction slightly more powerful than the faction that has slightly lost, but the very precariousness of the power transition means that the change of presidents hasn't had the kind of dramatic impact on renewable energy that you might have expected. And then Brazil is the opposite. I mean, Brazil usually has 28 or more political parties represented in the National Congress. So it is a kind of hyper-partisan system with many, many political parties. But one of the strangest things, and again, it was not something I particularly expected with renewable energy, but the very first renewable energy policy came from the PSDB, a center-right government. A year later, they left office and were replaced by the Workers' Party, the PT, which picked up their same renewable energy policy and ran with it. And when the Workers' Party president was impeached in 2015 and replaced with a president from the PMDB, he continued with the renewable energy. And when Bolsonaro came in, the only pro-environment position that he had was that he favored wind and solar power. So it's an astonishingly cross-partisan coalition in Brazil on wind and solar power, not on anything else. The country is hugely divided on climate change and on other kinds of things. But so you have, I think, really individual kinds of patterns in the two countries that are a big part of the story. And it certainly shows up in the book of why there is so much difficulty around building wind and solar power in South Africa, given those factions inside the ANC that none of them can manage to dominate the others. And then in Brazil, this is a part of, again, what allows technical actors to simply take the stances that they do, make the choices that they make.
Great, thank you for that. If the other panelists want to come in on that, if not, then I'll move on to the next question. There are a couple of questions that audience members have put to the panel about implications for other developing, emerging economies and global contexts. So I'm going to pick one question that's representative of some of these questions, but perhaps the panelists want to reflect a little bit further on the general lessons that follow from Kathy's analysis. And here is a question from Alejandra Padin, who's a policy analyst from Antigua and Barbuda. She says she works for the Department of Environment in a small island developing state. And she wants to know how to extend Kathy's observations from South Africa about the entrenchment of pro-carbon interests to smaller markets, which may not be able, who may not be able to support competition. How might this calculus change when countries are extremely climate vulnerable? And so this opens up a whole question about which of those models. I think, Kathy, you spoke to this already to some extent. Is it the Brazilian? Is it the South African model that is easier to replicate in other countries in terms of kicking off and sustaining that transition? And what can other countries learn from that? Kathy, do you want to start us off? And then if Jonas and Ken want to say a bit more about other countries and how they fit in, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think here I would start with the basic question of the current electricity system and what it looks like, because we have electricity systems in developing countries that might be heavily dependent already on fossil fuels, Angola, for example, or countries across the Middle East. So there are a number of developing countries that will already have these kinds of major actors in place that will then require really substantial contestation in order to change an electricity system. In contrast, countries that are mostly importing electricity, or countries that have yet to build out infrastructures, and I'm not sure exactly where your country would be, Alejandra, on that particular issue. Those are countries that I think have more options. And I think one issue that becomes really quite salient for a lot of developing countries is the finance question. And it's actually in the book, but not something we've really talked about yet. But there is the fact that renewable energy can sometimes be more expensive initially to build and pays out over longer periods of time. So the availability of finance that will help those countries do those initial investments and then save money over time by the fact that they're no longer importing coal, I think will help decide whether or not some of those countries that maybe aren't yet fully implicated in a fossil fuel electricity system, they might have additional choices if the finance is available. And of course, this is something that has changed very much over the 20 years or so that Brazil and South Africa have been considering renewable energy. It was once much more expensive and much more complicated to finance, but increasingly, not only have the costs come down quite a bit of wind and solar power, but also there's finance available specifically for this, some of it through the climate regime, more of it from private actors also moving into the sector. So I think there are more possibilities than there would once have been. Those are just some initial thoughts.
Great. Does anyone else want to come in on that question? Jonas?
Yeah, maybe briefly extend it. I mean, there's this question of smaller developing countries. Pivoting off Kathy's comments on finance, I think the question of international actors then becomes interesting, and what kind of incentives they provide for smaller countries. Multilateral finance, international NGOs, how then they interact with the power balance between progressive versus opposing coalitions in clean energy transitions in smaller countries. For instance, Jennifer Hedden at the University of Maryland is doing interesting work on the role of international NGOs and different types of investors around coal protests and coal plant deployment in developing countries. And it shows that these actors do matter in shifting power balances.
Okay, good. I'm moving on. Here's an interesting question that goes off in a very different direction. So let me put this to all of you. Keston Perry would like to ask a question about race and climate change and about the relationship between race and green transitions. And the question is both with reference to Brazil, which of course has the largest African diaspora community outside of Africa, and how that affects its politics and the state, and South Africa, which has some of the highest levels of inequalities, which are also shaped by race matters. How does race and its relationship to differentiated vulnerabilities and outcomes and to the state in terms of climate change affect this supposed equitable green transition that we're all aiming for? Does race matter in this story, and in what ways can it be dealt with? That's a big question, but I think it's an important one that we should consider. So as usual, Kathy, I'm going to turn to you since we're focusing on your book. Would you like to just respond?
I'm ready for this question. And I'm actually so excited because it lets me talk about another part of the book, chapter 5, that I haven't even talked about. So in Brazil in particular, one of the places where race becomes a really important part of the story is in the chapter on citing renewable energy projects in particular communities. And it is the Brazilian chapter that probably has the most to do with race. So we know from the UK, for example, that oftentimes local communities might object to having might object to having wind power plants in particular located in their communities. We know that that's been a part of the politics of localizing or building plants in particular locations. But we also know from economists that these wind power plants bring possibly economic opportunity to local communities. So this is a chapter that actually opens this up as a question. What do wind and solar plants mean for local communities? And the story in Brazil is really quite an interesting one. So one of the things that I do in this chapter, and it builds on a set of internet searches on the names of all 600 Brazilian wind power farms and the 77 cities that they're in, and look where I did a systematic search looking for whether or not local communities contested the presence of wind power in their communities. And I did a similar kind of analysis for South Africa. But in this case, the Brazilian one is the one where there is the most contestation, and it takes a really interesting shape on exactly the kinds of issues that you're asking about. So in about a quarter of these 77 cities, there is contestation from the local communities. And where is that contestation? It is not middle class and upper class consumers who are worried about the way wind turbines look, or some of those more aesthetic kinds of concerns that people have elsewhere. The communities that have issues with wind power plants in Brazil in particular are the communities that are in the Northeast. So the northeastern part of Brazil, for those of you who don't know Brazil, is the historic center of the Afro-Brazilian population that generations ago were brought as slaves, that have that continue to live in the region. It's a much poorer region. And importantly for this analysis, there are these remaining slave communities that have much less tenuous land claims, that are more contested. And a lot of especially the first generation of wind power plants in Brazil were put in coastal communities where these former slave populations have been traditionally occupying beaches, using them for fishing, using them for various kinds of small-scale economic activities, but without having some kind of secure land claim. And so when wind farms come into those communities, they can be hugely disruptive of the local economic activities of these largely African Brazilian communities. And so when you look at Brazil and you ask, where are the communities that have resisted wind power? It is exactly these kinds of communities, which is where opposition to wind power at the local level is found. And it's rather interesting because much of Brazilian wind is up in this former slave region of Brazil. And the other major area that has a lot of wind power is in the very south of Brazil, which is a heavily European population, a much wealthier population. And interestingly, there's almost no contestation of wind power plants down there. Instead, wind power plants have their own Facebook pages, and the news stories that showed up in my searches were school children going to look at them. So the question of race in Brazil is sort of hugely relevant to the placement of wind and whether there's contestation about that. And I know Robert is going to cut me off very soon looking at the time, but I did also in the talk mention in South Africa just how often race is part of the equation, because coal miners are Black, because populations who do not yet have electricity are Black, because of the racial differentiation in South Africa is just, it permeates the electricity sector like it does everything else. So these are very important themes in the book, and I hope people will look at it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathy. Indeed, we are very close to the end of our session. I just want to give our two discussants, Jonas and Ken, a last chance to say something about the book. Perhaps you want to summarize in one sentence why everyone should go out and buy and read the book in the coming days. After all, many of us are still in lockdown, so this is your chance. Ken, do you have any final words to add?
No, just that I enjoyed reading it very much, and I think it's a useful read for people interested in development, even people who don't work in the environment field. And I've learned a ton listening to the responses and the incredible questions in the chat and the Q&A as well. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Jonas, you have the last word, it seems.
Yeah, I also encourage everyone to get it as soon as possible and go into this very immersive journey. It takes multiple attacks to the same topic, but at the end you won't be confused. It comes up with some conceptual tool that allows everyone to either think about it for policy interventions or to develop their own research agenda in this space, because the four political economies, interlocking logics are very transferable ways of thinking that the book shares. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So this brings us to the end of this session. It's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity for both me and I think for all of you who listen to our panelists to be part of this event. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the panelists, to Kathy, to Jonas and to Ken for participating in the event. And if you've enjoyed this event and want to attend other similar such events, please do check out the Grantham Research Institute and the development department at the LSE's website. We host regular such events, and it will be a pleasure to welcome you back to the LSE. But for now, thank you to the panelists and have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.